So what we're going to do here is walk through the expert choice software that shows the decision model that we used today to evaluate four alternatives in the status quo acquisition strategy in terms of eight parts that made up the goal of developing a executable CG LIMS acquisition strategy. We can see here on the left is the list of what were the evaluation criteria that we had settled on. The 8 of them are minimizing the lifecycle cost, minimizing cost uncertainty, flexibility to quickly reprioritize requirements, deliverable in small usable segments, scalable based on funding, minimizing time to demonstrated software, minimizing time to initial operating capability and final operating capability, and minimize burden on the field. The first part of the process was to compare each of these criteria to each other one and come up with a value judgment on which one was more important compared to each other one. And we can see the results of that shown here in this table. And the way to read this for each cell that's highlighted, like 1.07, that's showing that the minimizing cost uncertainty is slightly more important than minimizing lifecycle cost. We would pay a little bit in order to minimize the cost uncertainty. And I'll scroll through each comparison while you take a look at the values, the description, and the relative difference in the length of the bars or in the size of the wedges of the pie chart to the right. And this was the first part of the process this morning. We had previously settled on what the evaluation criteria would be, and the first step is to come to a judgment on how important each one of those criteria is compared to each other. And the reason I'm going through and highlighting each one is because we don't all have the expert choice software. So this is an easy way of just being able to see the judgments that were made. And we did this by having the 6 people that were the core of the reboot team. They had participated in refining the alternatives. We reviewed what we'd collected in the wiki in terms of feedback on each, discussed each so we were clear, and then went through one at a time and made judgments on them. So this is how we expressed how important each of the criteria were. And then the next step in the process is to evaluate, do a pairwise comparison of each alternative compared to each other one in terms of each of the evaluation criteria. So for minimizing lifecycle cost, for instance, we made a pairwise comparison of each, and here we're judging that the alternative 2 does a better job of minimizing the lifecycle cost than alternative 1. And rather than scroll through each of these, what I'd like to do is now go back to the summary evaluation to see what the results were. And then at the end of this, I'll go through each individually so we've got kind of a record of what we said that you can walk through. So after comparing all of the decision criteria to each other, we can see the relative importance of each. So at the very top, the most important criteria is to minimize the burden on the field, followed by minimizing time to demonstrated software, flexibility, scalability based on funding, deliverable in small usable segments, minimizing time to IOC and FOC, minimizing cost uncertainty, and minimizing lifecycle cost. And that's not to say that lifecycle cost isn't important, but what it's saying is that we will pay a little bit more to minimize the burden on the field, and I think that's consistent with our value in the team. And let's then skip to the kind of the bottom line results after having judged every judged every alternative against every other one in terms of each criteria, the way I showed for the life cycle cost. We went through each of them, and we show you the bottom line, if you will. The alternative 2, 3, and 4 very closely ranked. Clearly, those three are close, and they exceed. They're more favorable than alternative 1, which is more favorable to the status quo. It's useful to see in the sensitivity graph. We can see across each criteria, minimizing life cycle costs, cost uncertainty, flexibility. And as I mouse over each, you can see in the bottom left corner, you can see what each one is. And we see, like we did in the last blue bar graph, 2, 3, and 4 very closely ranked. And working backward, we can see which dimensions there's a difference between them. So in minimizing time to IOC and FOC, you can see which one is superior. Time to demonstrated software, you can see the difference between them. Scalability based on funding, they're the same for small usable segments, same for flexibility. You can see the difference between them in minimizing the cost uncertainty. Another useful way of doing a quick sensitivity analysis, let's maximize that. These are the same priorities that we saw initially when they were sorted and showed that minimizing the burden on the field was the highest one. We can now, by moving these bars, we'll be able to see the impact on which alternative is favored. So the starting point with the results that were put into it, alternative 3 is the favored alternative. And I'll go through each criteria in turn and see the impact as we make it more important. So as life cycle cost becomes more important, you can see the preference for 3 increases. And then if we should be able to move it all the way back. For some reason it's stuck there. Let me set it back to where we were initially. If we make it less important, you can see what the impact is. So taken to the extreme where life cycle cost is not important at all, you can see what the results are in terms of the preference. I'll reset it back to the starting condition. I'll do the same thing with cost uncertainty. If minimizing cost uncertainty is the most important thing, you can see what the impact are in the results, and alternative 4 becomes the favored alternative. And then as we drive it back towards 0, you can see what the impact is. Reset to the initial conditions. Flexibility, if we increase the value that we place on it, 2, 3, and 4 become equally favored because they were equally as flexible. And make that 0 by hitting the home and then dragging it back to the left. You can see if it's not important at all, the values for 2, 3, and 4 are similar to where they were in the initial condition here. Deliverability in small usable segments, we'll do the same thing, making that more important. You can see very little impact on 2, 3, and 4 because they have very similar ability to be delivered in small usable segments. Scalability based on funding, as that becomes more important for us, you can see that alternative 3 becomes much more favored, as it is the most scalable based on available funding. And then towards, when it goes to 0, you can see 2, 3, and 4 very, very similar. Minimizing time to demonstrated software, that becomes more important. You can see that alternative 2 becomes more valued or more preferred, and 1 and 3 become similar. And as we go towards 0, you see the impact. Go to the starting condition. minimizing time to IOC and FOC as that becomes more important to us, more valued to us. Alternative 4 becomes more favored. And then back to the 0, you can see impact. And minimizing the burden on the field. As that becomes more important, you can see that since 2, 3, and 4 were equal in that regard, everything else becomes washed out, and 2, 3, and 4 become equal. And then if that goes to 0, if minimizing burden on field goes to 0, you can see the impact on the results. So that's really what I wanted to show, but just for completeness, we'll take a look back at each of the alternatives evaluated in terms of each criteria. Earlier we looked at the life cycle cost just to see how it was done, to see the actual values that we assigned. We'll go through each one in turn. And again, I will just scroll, or I'll mouse through each, and as I highlight the cell, you can see the words and the length of the bar, or the size of the pie chart, to see the judgments that we applied for each pair of alternatives in terms of the goal that's written in black in the center. So in terms of flexibility to quickly reprioritize requirements, I'm assuming that you'll be able to pause if you want to stop, just going through at a reasonable pace so that we can all see all of them. So there's no mystery about what our results were based on. And over time we'll add some of the words to the wiki to describe the conversation and the judgment, or the conversation that led us to these judgments. But I want to be clear about what the judgments were that we made on each to come up with the results that we came up with. We may be able to do this more professionally if we chose to, or if we need to. I just wanted to get something out quick and dirty so that you could see what we did to wind up where we wound up. And I think this is probably the simplest way of doing it, given that we don't all have the ability to use expert choice on the desktop. And we will be linking this this video file to the wiki. That's where we'll be downloading it from. If there's any questions that come up from this, there's a questions and answer page that you can edit to add the question. And with that, I am going to call this done.